then that winter, well, they had a real good, well, it put in a lot of grain and a lot of potatoes and so on, but he didn't get as much money out of that as he thought he was going to. There was too many guys couldn't pay him, and they some of them just paid him part and everything else. He didn't make as much money as he thought he was going to out of his tractor and plowing. And they seen that he's going to have a big potato crop. So he got a bunch of those guys that he'd plowed for to come and dig that big cellar. And it was pretty nice big cellar. The fall of 1920, he couldn't sell any of his grain. No, not 1920. No. Oh, let's see. I don't think they had such a big crop in 1920. 21 is when they had the big crop. And then they couldn't sell nothing. And that's when the horses got into the, well, he didn't have any place to store all that grain, so he put it out in the field and put the straw stack over it. And that's when the big team of horses got in there. I guess the mules in there too, but then they didn't eat enough to hurt them. But they, on the trail up to the house, there was one horse dead here and another horse back behind. And then they bought a sorrel team, and that mare, they was identical, only one was a horse and one was a mare. And that mare wouldn't let you put on a bridle. I don't know why, if she'd been a beat or something, putting on a bridle or something. She just fought so, and she fought around there and threw her head and broke the glass in the barn and cut her jugular vein. And Pop led her down to the house and wanted to know if I could sew it up. And I got a needle and some fish line. And when I first started working on her, why, she'd bled enough that she was wanting to be good. And he'd hold her, and I'd try to work up. And the blood would run off my elbows. And by the time I got that needle through there, she was down on her knees. And they, with his pliers, my working with it, why, I got it through both sides, but we broke the needle. And so I just pulled it out and wrapped the thread around it. You know, she got well and made a darn good horse and was real nice about getting the bridle on. And they, I don't know, it must have been in, 1922 it was dry. They didn't have nothing growed. And we had a lot of that grain left. And so Pop bought all the pigs he could get. Everywhere he could find a pig, why, he'd buy a pig. And they had a lot of potatoes, little potatoes. They didn't grow any size at all, just little old tiny things. And I don't know where he got the big old vat anyway. It was kind of like a fireplace under it. and we'd fill that up with grain and potatoes and cook them and feed those hogs. And then I don't think he got very much out of them. I don't remember. Anyway, they sold those. Got a little money, I guess, to do little things. I don't remember much about that part of it. And then I don't know whether it was Uncle Abe or Uncle Lee said maybe they could get a job in the oil fields. And so while I was in Missouri, my dad died. And then by 1923, Mama had married again. And so it got them to come up and stay on the place there and take care of things. And we went back to Oklahoma to see if they could get a job and get some money. And they was there about 30 days. And they went everywhere, every oil field and any other work that they could think of, and never did find a job. So they borrowed $50 from Uncle Lee to come home on. And then that's when they started selling off things. And Will told his dad that was his homestead, that he could stay there. And as we came back from Oklahoma, though, stopped in Canyon, and Chet Mercier had a garage down there then, and he told him that he could come down and go to work for him. And so I come back up and was getting rid of his tractor and everything. And he told his dad, he said that was his homestead and he could stay there. He still had his mules and things. And try to farm, and he says, no. He says, I'm not going to try it anymore. I'm going down the canyon with you. So we moved to Canyon, got the cheapest house we could get. And, Grandpa Pat stayed up here and still trying to sell off things. And he stayed with Inces while he was selling the rest of the things. That we had to have the furniture to go, stove and table and things, take to Canyon. And the mules was the last thing he sold. And I know he felt bad about selling them because they'd been faithful old mules. But Lee Newport bought them down there in Canyon. He had starved out and moved down there, bought a little place down there in Canyon. So he bought the mules. And that was the last thing, I guess, that was sold. And then Pop worked in that garage, and he got a Indiana truck and put a hired man out there on that to haul lead ore from Elsie. And he put sideboards on the thing and scoop shovels. And the first load, he went out with them, and he found out that they couldn't use the scoop shovels and they didn't need the sideboards. All they needed was more power to get up those hills from Elsie. And they left little old piles. He'd taken me up there one day, and there's just little old piles of ore every little hill where they'd had to unload some of it. And it wouldn't budge. It never, when that lead was loaded in the center of the truck, it stayed in the center. The tires was what hurt that job because there was so many ruts. Everything was, there was no pavement nowhere. On our trip to Taos, there was no pavement. We never got in no pavement at all. Dusty old roads. And the sidewalls on the tires was what ruined their tires. And any other hauling he could get, why he'd do that with these hired men. And he went on in the garage. And then Jack was born in that August. And then that next fall, after in 23, why he began to cough, and he just got so thin. And then by late spring, why he was so weak and just a coughing terrible. And I guess he had been to Dr. Sean, but he never told me nothing about it until he got so bad there, and I called the doctor to come over. And he says, I told you, Bill, that you wouldn't last 6 months if you didn't get out of that garage and all those fumes. And he says, get out in the hills and breathe the good clean air and the pine, or the scent of the timber. And he was down, he couldn't do nothing. So we sold everything we could sell. We kept Grandma's table, a drop leaf table, and sold the old cook stove, or traded it in on just a little one with a little funny oven that the firebox went over part of it, and it was on legs, real old-fashioned old stove. And I don't think we had any chairs. I don't remember any chairs. I think we sold them off and got another tent, and still had the old tent that Grandpa Pat had down in the timber. And I don't know how he found out about Bob Richardson up here having some prop timber. Anyway, it was in April, and it was colder than blue blazes. We came up and to get that timber out. Well, we didn't have any place to live. And I stayed in the house with Viola Richardson and their 2 kids. We slept put one of our mattresses on the floor at nighttime. The 2 kids and I slept there, and they put up the old tent, and Pop and his dad and the hired men slept out there. And they cut timber, logs, and built a house, one big room. And old Bob, he said he would help them and furnish the lumber for the where they had to have lumber. He had it there. Been going to build him a house ever since he'd lived there, but that shack was all he had, and it was awful little and awful skimpy. And his mother lived with him too. But when they got through there with that timber, why, they was to leave the log house. We had 2 little old windows about so big, and no floor. And I spent my days taking care of the 2 kids and grubbing out everything on the floor, that so it's kind of packed down and make a fairly level floor. And I don't know, we must not have been there over a couple months. Anyway, Art Bennett, he worked for them when they had such a big crop. And they lived here in town. And I think he worked in the saloon that was there in the Vincent Apartments. The front part of it was a saloon, and Mrs. Bennett run the restaurant in the back part. And when we was in town or something, we'd go there and eat with them. And then they'd moved to Salida. And he told them about some deal up there at Maysville above Salida. Another fella had got the contract, and then he was trying to subcontract it out to someone else. So we went loading up, though. Pop tried to help load what we had. And we had a dresser, and the dresser drawer, bottom dresser drawer, had his books in it. And from the time he had to leave high school, he'd taken all kinds of correspondence courses. One of them was Charles Atlas on physical fitness. And then another one was on gas and gas making. And another one was on gasoline and other motors and things. And that's how come he run before he went into the National Guard, why he was able to get that job making gas for Canyon City. He had his diploma on gas and gas making. I think he was about 19 years old at that time, I guess. Anyway, he got down on his knees when he couldn't lift that. Why, he got down on his knees out there, and there was snow on the ground, so it must have been, he wasn't there over a month or so, I think. And he was throwing out his books and everything, and he it just looked so pitiful. He was so sick and so weak and so thin, and throwing away all that he'd studied on. But he throwed him out there in the snow. I don't know, they probably saved him. I don't know what they did with him. And we moved up there, stayed a night or two with Bennett's in Salida, and then went up there at Maysville and put up the 2 tents. And that big old horse, I don't know, they must have rented him from somebody around there or something, I don't know. Or her, it was a big Belgian mare. They dragged these poles in to the tents and had sawhorses. And they put those poles up on those sawhorses, and Pop and I each had a drawing knife, and we'd peel those poles. Those logs had to be sawed up in certain lengths, peeled and sawed up. And then they hauled them to Denver to Kendall Mattress Company. They made mattresses out of those shredded Quakers. And then they didn't get all their money there. Mrs. Roebuck, that's the people that they'd got the contract from. I don't know. She must have spent their share and all on clothes. Anyway, they couldn't get their money, and sung that song, and that's where our money goes, to buy Mrs. Roebuck clothes. But then from there they moved over. I don't know who owned that land, but there was a lake in the center and then two identical log cabins on each side, or one on each side. And we moved into that log cabin, and that was way up in that there Maysville territory. There was nice little cabins, but we weren't there too long, and they got props and Quakers there. And then I don't know who told him about there was timber at Maysville or Nestorville, and so they went on to their Labor Day, doing there at Nestorville, and Mr. Moss, Tom Moss, was there, and Fred Jones. Now, Fred Jones used to live at Hillside, and when they worked over there for Mr. Holman, before I ever knew any of them, why, Fred Jones got acquainted with him. And he told him that Moss had some timber, and he introduced them. And it was getting too late then to go to see the timber that night, and so Fred said that they's going over and stay all night with somebody else, and for us to go up to his cabin he had up there in Nestorville and stay all night, and then they'd go look at the timber the next day. And that's what we did. And so then it was to go back to up there and move everything down to Nestorville, and there was 2 or 3 boys staying there with Mr. Moss in the big house, and I don't know what these boys did. Anyway, they had a little cabin, just 2 rooms, not far from the big house. And Stanley, he was talking then, he called it the Fuzzy House, because it was built out of Quaker logs and the bark had all fuzzed off, and he called it the Fuzzy House. And we lived in there a while in those 2 little rooms. And then we moved to, they got out of the big house, and we moved in the big house. And then October in June, I guess, of 26, why, there was quite a bit of saw timber on the old man Moss's place. The old man Moss wanted to sell it, and so they bought the ranch and the saw timber. They'd already cut out the Quakers and the props, so they bought the ranch and the saw timber, and then they decided to buy a small sawmill, and they was putting it up and needed a conveyor trough to convey the sawdust up away from the saw. And at noon, Will asked me, he says, when you get your dishes cleaned up and everything, can you take the kids' little wagon and keep that sawdust out, because we don't want to dig a pit. They just wanted to keep it away from there until they could get enough lumber sawed for the conveyor. And that's when I got my finger cut off, is digging that sawdust out, and I seen a edging came down, and I just reached over to get it, and it caught in the saw and sawed my finger off. And then and that was in June. And then Jean was born that October. And I don't know just how long we were there. Quite a while. And then after, Jack McPeak came up there and started working at the sawmill, and his wife lived in the little fuzzy house. And then we moved the mill and us into Neil Shirley's house. Wasn't, maybe 2 or 3 miles from there. And they sawed his timber out. And then they moved from there to Brush Creek over here. But they still had that ranch there of Old Man Moss's, and put in a crop of potatoes every year for, I don't know, 3 or 4 years or something. And Jack McPeak stayed there and planted the potatoes and taken care of them. And they had real good potatoes there. And then from Lake Creek we moved to Brush Creek. And then school started, and we moved from Brush Creek down, didn't move the mill. We moved down to Barry's house. And they had a little, I don't know, 2 or 3 rooms there by their main house.
What year was that?
Well, it must have been, Jean was born in 26, so it must have been 27 or 8. I'm not right sure. Might have been 28. And then after school was out, we moved to another set on Brush Creek. And that's where we lived when Jim was born in 1929. And then I don't know where the kids went to school in 1930. Must have taken them to school.